Good afternoon and good evening. I say good morning because we have online attendees. To all of our attendees in the room and online, welcome to another seminar in the seminar series of ENGL, PolyU, this time with a very interesting topic, feedback literacy. So before we start, can our online attendees please confirm that they can hear me loud and clear? Is there any response in the chat box? Yes. Okay, good. So, it's about our invited speaker. First, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Professor David Carless works at the Faculty of Education, University of Hong Kong, and is the head of the academic unit, SLAVE, I hope that I'm pronouncing it correctly, Social Context and Policies in Education. He is one of the pioneers of feedback literacy research and is listed, good numbers are coming up, as a top 0.1 cited researcher in the Stanford top 2% list for social science as well. So his books include Designing Effective Feedback Processes in Higher Education, a learning-focused approach, a must-read. I personally recommend it. It was published by Routledge in 2019, and he was the winner of a University Outstanding Teaching Award in 2016. Congratulations for that. For more details about Professor Carless, please visit his website. You can find interesting information there related to his latest publications and achievements. Again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. As the routine goes, we will have the talk for 45 minutes to 50 minutes. After that, we will take questions and comments. Thank you very much. To you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here because this is where my tertiary career started. 35 years ago, I was a part-time instructor in this very department, teaching EAP to very nice Hong Kong PolyU students. So I've been in Hong Kong for 36 years now, and this was my starting point. So it's great to be here. I'm going to try to do two things. In the first half of the talk, I'm going to try and illustrate some concepts, feedback literacy, feedback seeking. And in the second half of the talk, I'm going to apply them to a paper that I did with some colleagues recently, where we interviewed doctoral supervisors about their feedback practices. I will try and embed some points that can be of interest to you, whether you're a doctoral student, a seasoned researcher, a teacher, etc. I put my Twitter handle there. I have posted the slides there. They're also on SlideShare. If you go to SlideShare and you put my name in, the organizers also have a copy. So if you're the kind of person who likes to get a copy of the slides, they're freely available. That's my little introduction. So I should say that this is not an applied linguistics talk. I know a lot of you are applied linguistics. Earlier in my career, I did some applied linguistics research, and I also did some assessment of feedback in higher education. And I did something that I encourage you all to do midway through your career, to do a kind of review, a kind of monitoring process and work out how you are, how you're doing. Because I think when we start out, there's a frantic desire to publish a lot of papers in order to get promotion or a job or tenure. And I think you can be quite frantic. I certainly was when I was looking for a job early in my career. I think at a certain point of time, you need to think, where can I make a contribution? What do I want to be well known for? And can I develop a coherent research strategy so that you build up a coherent research platform? When I look back on my career, in the early days, I published quite a few different papers on different topics. And I'm not sure it was quite the right strategy. And that's a kind of monitoring strategy. But there it is, as I said, feedback seeking, feedback literacy, and doctoral education. The next one. Yeah, and the next one. So feedback literacy is defined as the attitudes, the capacities, the dispositions to make sense of and use feedback information for the purposes of improvement. So it's the idea that all of us, whether we are students or doctoral students or researchers, that whatever feedback comes at us, we try to use it for ongoing improvement purposes. Now, I guess that sounds quite obvious, but I think you also know the phenomenon that with an end of semester assignment, sometimes you spend a lot of time doing some comments and then the student just says, look at the grade, moves on. So it isn't as easy as maybe it sounds. And then, next slide, please. And then we developed this framework, verging on the idea of taking action, that the purpose of all feedback is to lead to some kind of action in the learner or the academic, whoever is using the feedback. So appreciating feedback is essentially seeing the value of feedback as a process, thinking feedback is something that is worth my while seeking and working with. Making judgments is the idea of peer feedback, self-assessment, working out how you're going, how you can improve. Managing affect or working with the emotions. As we all know, feedback can have a powerful emotional impact. You've sent your wonderful article for review, the reviews come back and they are brutal comments and you're rejected. What do you do? Well, some of us will think, okay, I'll leave it for a couple of days, but then you come back to it and you try and make sense of the comments. You try and plan for your next journal, these kind of things. And emotional impacts can also be very powerful for our first year undergraduate students or our master degree students. You know, they're finding their path. Doctoral student, first supervision tutorial. You know, you're feeling a bit nervous and a bit worried. So feedback always has to cater for these emotional aspects. And then feedback seeking, I would place under the appreciating feedback dimension, and I've defined feedback seeking here. And you can see the idea of application there resonating with the taking action strand of the previous slide. Feedback seeking is usually divided into two main strategies: inquiry and monitoring. And I guess inquiry is the more obvious one of the two. When you hear the word feedback seeking, you probably think it's somebody reaching out to another person and asking them for comments. So before we submit our articles to journals, we usually have some trusted friends who will give us some critical comments on our article before we submit it. We know our students often form peer collaborative networks with their classmates and often will help each other. There can also be indirect inquiry. One or two colleagues are going to take me out to dinner after this talk, so I could say to them, well, what did you think about this? Or, you know, when I got to the theory part, do you think I was that solid on the sociocultural learning theory? You know, there are ways in which we can start up a conversation through feedback. It's also something you can do on your own, which is monitoring. In other words, looking at examples, looking at rubrics, if you're a student, or if you're an academic, looking at the scope of the journal you're thinking of submitting to, looking at the editorial board, guessing who might be the reviewer or who might be strategic to cite, looking at the examples in your target journal, getting a sense of the kind of debates in the field, the kind of articles they publish. So monitoring is a feedback-seeking strategy that we use when we use our own resources to understand what we're trying to do. And that's kind of a classic way of distinguishing strategies of feedback-seeking between inquiry and monitoring. And as you can probably guess, it's more powerful if you combine the two, so that you're actually talking to people as well as doing your desk work when you work out for the feedback seeking strategies. Now, obviously, there are costs and values to this kind of feedback. The most obvious cost is to your ego and your image, and that a lot of people don't like to admit their uncertainties. They don't necessarily like to go up to somebody and say, well, actually, I'm not quite sure about this theory or this methodology. Can you give me some advice? They're not meant to be exactly matching on the left and right hand side, but they are three costs and three values. And there's also a certain amount of effort, obviously, in feedback seeking. If you're a student, you've got to try and reach out to your teacher. Maybe you're emailing your supervisor saying, please, 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 can I have a bit of feedback on this piece of work or this methodology? And then there's the impression management idea. I guess we want to seem motivated and interested, but we don't want to seem so troublesome and so needy. So if we keep emailing the same person day after day, asking for more and more support, they're going to kind of get annoyed. So it's kind of a difficult kind of balance there between feedback values and costs. But I think I would argue that feedback seekers are generally high achievers, and feedback seekers generally do better in life. And I think this goes across education and entrepreneurship and management. There's a lot of feedback-seeking literature in the organizational field, in business. Newcomers in the workplace, they generally will reach out to some of their colleagues to seek feedback on the norms of the workplace. So it's something that's been researched quite extensively in a lot of different disciplines. So I've been working in the feedback-seeking space for about 5 or 6 years now, and going to just share a couple of articles. They both took me a very long time, I must say. But in this article, we were trying to get a sense of the feedback-seeking research in undergraduate education across different disciplines. And we did a scoping review, we did all those Prisma strategies, and we ended up with 42 articles. My co-author, Martijn Liemek from the Netherlands, he did a lot of the heavy lifting in that side of it. We also did something that I highly recommend to all of you if you're doing any kind of review paper, is having an expert group. An expert group gives you an opportunity for feedback seeking in a way. So we consulted with our expert group at the beginning, in the middle, and towards the end of this 3-year, 9-month process. And they gave us a lot of very useful advice. Through our connections, we were able to have an expert group of about 10 or 12 people, 5 or 6 identified by me and 5 or 6 by Martijn. And that was a really helpful process. And I think it adds to the rigor. And I think it also brings a kind of partnership into the process. Now, as the introduction kindly mentioned, so it eventually came out in Educational Research Review. That is a journal with an impact factor of 11.7, and that's a career high for me. So I was pretty happy when it finally came out. We had 3 reviewers. They gave us a whole ton of things. 3 reviewers all wrote about 2 or 3 pages. So we had a lot of stuff to do. It took us about 6 months. We did a really good job, I thought. We sent it back. 2 of the 3 reviewers said accept, and the 3rd reviewer, he gave us a whole load of other things to do, and he kept us going for another few months, but it really did help the quality. So I think that's a feedback literacy thing. I mean, some people would think, oh, these reviewers are annoying, they keep asking for so many things, but actually it improves the quality, and improving the quality improves the impact in the citation. So although it kept us busy for a very long time, it was a positive process and a positive ending. As was kind of mentioned, I've been a kind of pioneer of feedback literacy research, and one of the things I was interested in was trying to tease out the relationship between feedback literacy and feedback seeking. And after a lot of head scratching and various conversations, I think I'm reasonably solid that these 2 concepts are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. I had to write this bit down because I get confused trying to say it. But by feedback seeking, I believe you enhance your feedback literacy. And then from the other point of view, if you are feedback literate, you're going to be more likely to reach out for feedback. Yeah. And then I asked ChatGPT, I said to ChatGPT, what is the relationship between feedback literacy and feedback seeking? And it kind of hinted that feedback literacy was the more important concept. So being a cunning kind of guy, I then said to it, what is the relationship between feedback seeking and feedback literacy? Now, I don't know about you guys, but if you talk to a human and you say, what's the difference between A and B, or what's the difference between B and A, I think a human will give you the same answer. But with ChatGPT, it gives me quite contrasting answers. Whichever term I put first, it seemed to establish as a slightly more higher order of the two. I don't know about you, but I find with ChatGPT, you have to interrogate it a little bit. On the first question, it won't give you that much. So I said, hey, come on, ChatGPT, you can't have it both ways. Which way is it? And then we got into quite an interesting discussion. And it seemed to be saying this kind of thing. And then I thought, well, is this bad if I'm taking one of my main points from ChatGPT? But then fortunately, I found in my slides for a presentation I did about 2 years ago that I'd said the same point. So I kind of felt that I was kind of on firm ground. But I think they probably are, but they probably are kind of interrelated in that way. But what is interesting to me is that feedback seeking has a history of at least 30 years, particularly in the organizational management field. Well, feedback literacy has only been a term in the last 10 years, maybe even less. So that could be an argument for this one being more central, but that's probably an idle debate to many of you, but it's the kind of thing that intrigues me a little bit. The second piece of research, and this was even more scary for me, because the sample size of this research is 1. So I was really, really worried for so many years that nobody will want to publish an article with a sample size of 1. But we tried to do some interesting things. It's longitudinal over 4 years. And I think a 4-year study has some originality and value. It's also talking about feedback seeking through the eyes of an undergraduate co-author. Not just feedback seeking through the eyes of an undergraduate, she's actually the co-author. And we had transcripts, which I think is always nice, so we could do some kind of discourse analysis of the interaction she had with her teachers. But not surprisingly, the first journal it went to rejected it. One of the reviewers said, well, Professor, this really isn't a very clever thing to do, to work with one student, kind of very dismissive, fair enough. But the second, more sophisticated reviewer saw a lot of value in what we were doing, appreciated the longitudinal aspect, the originality, and gave us some really good comments. Now, when you get one negative review and one positive review, you never really know. The editor might ask you to resubmit or not, but this guy, fair enough, he said reject. And then we had to go on to the next journal. And I did a strange thing. I thought, wow, I've got rejected from the first journal. Well, normally if you're rejected, you then go to an easier journal or a lower ranked journal. But it seemed to me that the sophisticated reviewer liked it, but the unsophisticated reviewer didn't. So I thought, hey, I'll go for a higher ranking journal for the next submission. But I had another more logical reason. The next journal I went to would give me 1,000 more words in the word guidelines. Normally, I think short articles are better than long articles because people don't have the patience to read them and review them. But because this was longitudinal, and to bring out the beauty of the longitudinal method, we did really need a bit more space. And we had these transcripts, and transcripts take a lot of space, and then you need to analyze them. And they had to be longitudinal transcripts, so we had to have some from year 1, some from year 2, and some from year 3. So I really think we did need a bit more space. And to my great satisfaction, this one was eventually accepted in Higher Education, which is one of the best journals of higher education studies. The reviewers asked us to argue the conceptual originality and conceptual relevance. So we coined this term student reflective female literacy as a kind of little strand of female literacy. And we use this sociocultural discourse analysis popularized by Neil Mercer, who's a pretty fantastic prof in University of Cambridge. And yeah, I think we were lucky with the reviewers and really appreciate the executive editor being quite supportive of our efforts. And that one took 5 years from the beginning to the end. So you can see as I get into my not so young age, I'm slowing down. But even though they were struggling, it took a long time. It brought me a certain amount of satisfaction. So that's how we define this concept of reflective feedback literacy, a considered analysis. Reflection is quite a slippery term, isn't it? A considered analysis, and then after analyzing, trying to do something with it, to use it. And I hope that concept might be a tiny bit useful. And here he is. He's not sitting on his toilet, I hope, but I mean, he looks a bit elegant there, the thinker. We like thinkers. Now, feedback literacy, I've tried to suggest, has resonance whether you are a professor or an early career researcher, a student, a human being, or a chatbot. I mean, I think it strands everything. This isn't my research area, but 1 or 2 people have started doing some work about feedback literacy for academics. I've tried to embed in what I've said so far some kind of issues that academics face in terms of publishing. I'd like to tell you a little story at this point. Martin Warren was a professor here for many years, Professor Martin Warren. I don't know if you know him at all, but I was in the Education University for a long time, and around 2005, I built up enough publications to become a decent candidate to get a position in Hong Kong U. And I got a job there as associate professor in 2005. So one of the things very important for me at that stage was to get research grants, specifically the General Research Fund or GRF. So what I did is a feedback-seeking monitoring strategy. I tried to look down the websites of the universities in Hong Kong to see which professors in education or applied linguistics seemed to be pretty good at getting GRF grants, these competitive research grants that I was going for. And I noticed that Martin Warren of Hong Kong Poly had a particularly good record of GRF grants. And I noticed a few other people. And then my next door neighbor, Professor Bill Littlewood, who was one of the pioneers of communicative language teaching in the 80s and 90s, he said to me, David, we're going to go to the horse racing at Sha Tin Racecourse next week. Would you like to come? And I said, sure. And he said, Martin Warren and his friend is going to be there as well. I said, fine. So we went up there to the horse racing. And it's about 6 races, and they're about once every half an hour. And you make a small monetary investment on each race, hoping to increase your capital. And about halfway through the evening, I could see Martin sitting there on his own, deciding which horse to pick. So I went up to Martin and said, Martin, do you mind if I ask you some questions about GRF grants? And he said, he gave me a slightly quizzical look, and he said, okay. So then I asked him, well, what's your strategy? What are they looking for? What do you do? And he told me that he will submit to this exercise every single year. Now, I don't know about you, I wouldn't like to do that, because personally, I don't find it that much fun applying for research grants. Because if you apply for a research grant, you have to wait for 9 months for the results. And then if you don't get it, you have to do it again. And this is all based on a hope that in 2 or 3 years' time, you might have enough data to do a research article. But anyway, that's how it works. And he said, I do it every year. And he said, it's my habit. September, October, I come back from my summer break, and then I work on my GRF. And if I get 2 in consecutive years, well, I'm super happy, but it seldom happens. So sometimes I get one year, and then I don't get it the next year. Then I revise and resubmit. And I thought, well, that's a good strategy. So anyway, I learned a lot through my feedback-seeking strategy. I wasn't too worried that he might think, well, this is a very strange guy. Oh, now what have I done now? If I, oh, it's a smart thing, so if I touch it. Oh dear. Oh, here we go. So thanks for the feedback. I know now not to touch the screen, I just can't point.
Or you can actually.
This one. Oh, yeah, I could. I'm too scared to try that. Oh, where was I? Yeah, and then a few months later, somebody said, oh, this was a friend of Martin Warren. So Martin Warren says to his friend, oh, that David Carless, he's a serious guy. I was at the races, just enjoying myself, and he comes out and interrogates me on how to get a GRF grant. But if people go around saying I'm a serious guy, I think I don't mind. It's better to be a serious guy than what's the opposite of serious?
Not having a grant.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the whole point. Much better to get the grant. And actually, the first time I submitted the GRF, I got the grant. But then I made a mistake. I didn't follow Martin's advice. I thought I've got the grant, I'll just get on doing the grant. And I waited until I finished the grant, and then I put in for the next one. But then I didn't get it. So I was only getting 2 every 5 years, while Martin was getting like 3 every 5 years. Sorry for that digression. I hope that entertained you a little bit. But I'm trying to illustrate that feedback seeking has a lot of value for your career. And even if people might think you're a bit strange, if you get the grant and you get tenure and you get a job and you become a professor in Hong Kong U, maybe it's worth the effort. I will now speed on to the second half of the talk, which is trying to apply some of those concepts to doctoral education. And I suppose I'm going to try and argue that giving comments in writing on drafts of work in progress is a strategy, but I think maybe there are richer and more interesting strategies. This was our paper that came out in Studies in Higher Education about 4 months ago, and it was called Feedback as Socialization Towards the Enactment of Authentic Feedback. I don't know if you can see this one. Oh, I've done it again. He doesn't learn from the feedback, this guy, does he? It says received 12th of June, it's sent to 26th of July. We got 2 reviews after 4 weeks, they both really liked it. So that's pretty quick. Full acceptance in 5 or 6 weeks. Now, that doesn't mean the paper is good, it just means the reviewers liked it or the reviewers are easygoing. So who knows? So what we did is we interviewed 20 colleagues in our faculty about their supervision practices. Now, you might say interviewing 20 of your colleagues is not a fantastic database, but on the other hand, it's not too bad. This, however, was a failed GRF. What we planned to do was to interview supervisors, interview a load of their students, and what we really wanted to do is some observation of tutorials where maybe on the Zoom, we could sit in the background, watch the tutorial, see how the feedback was evolving, then talk to the teacher and talk to the student. And we pitched all this in the GRF and we got the result of 3.5. And those of you who know GRF, General Research Fund, 3.5 means fundable but not funded, you need to get a 4. And then I had to go to Cambridge University to help my daughter induct into her first year in Cambridge, and I was on sabbatical, so I didn't resubmit the next time. So this study was scaled down from something that would have been a bit richer to interviews with 20 supervisors. And we did it on the Zoom because the Zoom, as you know, does a partial transcription. I don't find it great for accuracy, but we tidied it out, but it is a help. Also, we did a little focus group at the end. So we did 20 and then a subset of those 20, 4 or 5 of them, we tried to pitch our provisional findings to them and get their feedback on it. So yeah, that was the data for the research. Part of the conceptual backdrop to the paper is the things I talked about in the first half. So those feedback literacy kind of concepts, authentic feedback. But the other part of it was sociocultural learning theory that I think is a good fit for this kind of research. And I think it's a good fit for what goes on in doctoral education. because you've got the socialization, you've got the dialogue, you've got the co-construction. The way I do qualitative research, the research questions tend to evolve and be modified a little bit along the way. In the beginning, I was hoping to do feedback literacy for supervisors. I was hoping to identify what are the feedback literacy capacities of supervisors. But I found this data set couldn't really do that. But what this data set could do, I think, was answer those two questions. The first one trying to unpack how they interpreted and implemented feedback. So one of the core questions after a little while was, well, how do you define feedback? What does feedback mean to you? And then the second thing was that for some of the interviews, it came out that the supervisors saw a much broader realm of feedback rather than just the supervisor giving comments or the supervisor giving spoken comments, but saw a kind of socialization into the norms of academia as part of it. So that ended up as the second research question. So a brief attempt at answering the first question. The analysis of the data suggested that there were kind of three groupings. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I think to me they go into a kind of hierarchy, with maybe the enactments, the putting into practice being even more sophisticated than the comments and the dialogue. But obviously dialogic feedback in doctoral education is quite a significant thing. And a couple of quotations. This professor talked about the feedback seeking element that he expects his doctoral students to develop their capacities in asking insightful questions about research. And I've certainly seen that with my other doctoral students, that by the end of the process, they will come into the tutorial, they will tell me what they're thinking about what they've read, then they will maybe put forward some ideas and then ask me what I think about them. So I think that idea of feedback seeking through more sophisticated questions, the dialogue and the co-construction are important. But some of the supervisors also talked about some of the challenges of procrastination or unwillingness to share work in progress. And I don't know about you guys, but I find this particularly with the ethical approval process. Because, you know, when you're going for ethical approval, you need to attach the research proposal. And my students always say, well, I want to work longer on my research proposal. I haven't got the theoretical framework worked out. I haven't really finalized the methodology. I need to do more reading. But I say to them, you can't really progress with the research until you've got ethical approval. And then you can start doing pilot data collection. And the pilot data collection will inform your methodology and your strategies. And everything is a draft, isn't it, in academia? You know, you go through hundreds and hundreds of drafts and you submit it and you get feedback and you have to revise it. And I think that's what this professor was saying, that many of our students, and of course a lot of our students come from mainland China, they kind of see good work as being correct. They worry that if they submit something and they send back for revision, that they've somehow done something wrong. But we know that in academia, it's this iterative refinement concept. Whenever I submit the ethical approval document, the administrator always sends me back some further comments. When are you going to destroy the data? Is it going to be password protected in a locked cabinet? You know, there's all these formulas. Yeah. So in relation to the second research question, which was what are the broader feedback inputs beyond the supervisor? In the paper, we talked about two strands of broader feedback inputs. The first was journal peer review, and the second was when you go to conferences, and conferences are a side of feedback. The other three I put at the bottom there: peer feedback, feedback from visiting scholars, feedback from your teachers and other staff. They were all mentioned, but they were not substantial themes. And I think particularly for peer feedback in doctoral education, other scholars have treated the topic differently or better. So we just focused on those first two, and I'll give a little flavor of those two. I was very happy when I was interviewing this guy and he said this: co-authoring and submitting to good journals are the best ways to get feedback because you obtain experts' opinions. This is generating authentic feedback. Now, the reason I was really happy when you use this term authentic feedback is I happened to have co-authored a paper called Authentic Feedback a few years before, and it gave me a paper or a theoretical concept that I could hang onto. And his idea was it's authentic feedback because in the viva, the oral examination, your examiners may put similar questions to what the reviewers have put. And I think that's a very good point. For that reason, I always encourage my full-time doctoral students to submit papers for publication at least a year before they finish, because it gives you that time and space to see how external reviewers are relating to your work, what kind of reactions they have, what kind of comments they're making, and whether you get accepted or rejected. I think it's a very good process of getting into the field of academic publishing. I think submitting to journals for doctoral students is also very good because it forces you to think about the discussion, the significance, and the conclusion earlier than you would if you were just writing in a linear way. I often find with our PhD candidates in Hong Kong U that the conclusion is always a bit undercooked, but the literature review has gone through so many iterations for so many years, and I think that's a shame, because actually the conclusion is probably the most important, and also the significance. And my doctoral students, again, would often procrastinate. They will say, wow, I'm not ready yet to write the conclusion, or I'm not ready yet to claim the theoretical significance. But the longer you wait, it doesn't get any easier. And I always say to them, it'll be easier to do a convincing conclusion once you have a draft, and once you've got some feedback, and once you work with it. So I think to draft your conclusion and your avenues for further research earlier rather than later is a very good strategy. So once this guy had mentioned this authentic feedback concept that I've written about before, I tried in my interview protocol to ask the other respondents a bit more about co-authoring and see what they said. Because in our university, a lot of the professors are co-authoring with their doctoral students. And another guy said this: peer-reviewed feedback is authentic, part of the real world. Once you get a job as an assistant professor, you're going to be dealing with this peer-reviewed feedback for the rest of your career. So it's a really critical skill. So this kind of gave me a bit more confidence. This idea of authentic feedback was worth running with. And in this paper that I published with Phil Dawson from Deakin University in Australia, we defined authentic feedback as feedback processes resembling the practices of the discipline, the profession, or the workplace. And for this paper, because I'm interested in how feedback plays out in different disciplines, so I went to the Queen Mary Hospital with one of my colleagues, and they were doing the clinical clerkships. So her students, doctors, were examining the patients, and she was able to demonstrate how you can press the stomach in different ways. She was able to demonstrate how you examine a baby without making it cry, which is a pretty critical skill. So these were kind of what we call authentic feedback. So the second strand of authentic feedback in doctoral education in this paper was to do with conferences. And this slide is about the preparation. again, as a doctoral student, when you're preparing for a conference, you've got to draft the abstract. You may only have a couple of hundred words. So you've got to think, well, what is the essence of what I'm doing? How can I encapsulate this? How can I argue it? So you're generating a lot of self-feedback and you're getting a deeper understanding of your paper, your thesis, etc. But then when you get there, you may or may not get some feedback from the audience. If you're good at handling the timing, which I'm just about on time, you may be more likely to get feedback from the audience. But you also have another strategy. During the break time, you don't often get that much feedback, I don't think, in the formal presentation. But afterwards, during the break time, you can always go up to someone and say, oh, thank you very much for attending my presentation. And normally they say, oh, it was really good, it was really insightful. And then you find out they can't remember what you were talking about. But you have the option of saying, oh, what did you think about that part? Do you have any good ideas on implications for practice? So if you're skillful, you can generate some feedback, or you can just say to them, oh, it was my first conference and I was really nervous. Please just say something nice and make me happy. And then it's, oh, it was really good. One of the things, finally on that paper, is there's this term feedback enactment in the literature, and we tried to give it a little bit of a definition because we think the proof of the feedback pudding is in the eating. So in other words, it's in the enactment, putting into practice. So making use of different feedback inputs. So the supervisor, the peers, the peer reviewers, the people at conferences. And I think it's a pretty neat way of improving. If you realize how bad I was 20 years ago, and I knew virtually nothing about anything, but by constantly sort of seeking feedback, sending things to journals, I think I gradually got to a position where I'm actually not too bad. So just in the last 5 minutes, I will try and tie up some implications and future directions. So I don't know if I went a bit too fast in the second half, but just to try to summarize, what we've tried to argue in that paper, that feedback is much more than comments from your supervisor. Of course, comments from your supervisor are really important, and your supervisor is a kind of proxy for the examiners. But what your supervisor, I think, is trying to do is to introduce you into the norms of academia. What are the kind of questions that your examiners will ask you? What are the kind of reactions you will get from academia or when you submit to a journal? And one of my interviewees in this study, he was quite firm about that. He said when his students ask him a question, and he's the supervisor, he will phrase it not as his opinion, but he will phrase it as the kind of thing academics would say is this. And I think it's true, isn't it? That I think as supervisors, we're drawing on all the things that have been said to us over the years, all the things we know about academia. I think that's quite important, that it's not a supervisor's opinion, but it's the kind of thing that academics would usually say. You know, they always talk about narrow focus, don't they? And they always say, don't go too broad. Say a lot about a little rather than a little about a lot. You know, the narrow kind of focus. And it's mediated with the sociocultural theory. And I've tried to claim that it's authentic feedback, mirroring research work, because as academics, we go to conferences, we try to elicit feedback from conferences. We go to our colleagues, we brainstorm, we go to ChatGPT and have an interesting conversation, I hope. We get rejected by journals, but we move on. We have our research grants reviewed and we try again, etc., etc. So, sorry you can't see it at the bottom, but there's a very nice paper done by William and his colleague a few months ago that actually looked at the kind of issues I'm looking at, but in a very nice way. He had an academic and 4 doctoral students, and it was all about writing for publication, and they had WeChat extracts. So they actually went in a bit more detail than probably we did in a really nice paper. So thanks, William. And that's kind of why I'm here, because William and I were talking about his paper and my paper, and he said, why don't you come over and do a talk? So thanks very much for that, William. Now, what I was hoping to do in this paper, but I wasn't really able to because of the limitations of my data set. But because I'm a feedback literacy kind of pioneer, and I've done feedback literacy for students, I've done feedback literacy for teachers, and I wanted to do feedback literacy for doctoral supervisors. But just interviewing 20 people in our faculty didn't really enable us to go too far, but I have a few speculations that I've put at the end of the paper in discussion. And I think this would be a fantastic topic for further research. Doctoral supervisor feedback literacies and doctoral student feedback literacies, and maybe the interplay between the two. But I think these are some of the dimensions, and there may be more dimensions. But I think this is the sophistication of how you conceive of feedback. To me, feedback as comments, fine, but feedback as dialogue, feedback as enactment, a bit more worthwhile. The socio-cultural co-construction that I talked about, the enactment. Some of the supervisors talked about feedback as moving the research forward, or feedback as moving the researcher forward. Because it's both of those, isn't it? It's not only making the research better, but giving you the skills, the tools, the capacities to be an autonomous researcher in the future. And then I'm thinking that these authentic forms of feedback, such as going to conferences, how to make the most out of going to conferences. I don't think anybody teaches you that, but what kind of strategies are worth doing? One of my colleagues is brilliant at conferences. She goes up to these famous professors, chats them up, invites them to Hong Kong. Later, they end up as co-authors. And she got to full professor in Hong Kong U partly through co-authoring with all these guys that she scooped up at conferences. So there's all sorts of strategies. I didn't say that in the correct way. Yeah, just finally, I mean, I did mention feedback seeking in generative AI, but it does seem that it kind of acts as a counter to some of those worries about contacting the teacher. A lot of students worry about asking so many questions of the teacher, because then the teacher will realize the gaps in their knowledge and that they don't know the stuff that maybe they should know. The great thing with ChatGPT, you can ask it whatever you like. It'll never get tired, it'll never get bored, and it'll never think you're really annoying. It will just keep on answering questions all night long. And that's obviously an area for further research. The references are all there. And thank you very much. And it's time for questions.